expenses. We'll talk about the Workamajig way, which is how we envision you using the tool workflow-wise to enter purchase orders, to enter the vendor invoices that are connected to them. If you're not using purchase orders today and that's a new topic for you, we'll probably give you enough to get very, pretty started on that, but you would probably want to do the help guide or work with your account manager if you've never used purchase orders, because it's going to be pretty high level. But we always have those nice sections in the help guide that can walk you through that. We're also going to talk a lot about setup for purchasing. So you might say, well, I've been in the system for quite a while. I don't need to know how to set it up. It's really just a touch on to say, how do things flow through and what can you maybe make easier on yourself by putting like a markup at an item level or markup at the client level. Some people don't know about that. We're also going to look at the general ledger tracking section so you can see how you can default some GL accounts. If you say, well, I don't have access to that area of the system, Marlene, no problem. You would just get with your administrator who can for sure access it. And if it's something you think needs to be changed after this conversation today, you can absolutely go to your admin and they can either change it, or if they have more questions, they want to say, well, my employee told me about this, I need more information, they can come to their account manager and we'll help walk them through that. We're going to create an estimate. Of course, in Workamajig, the estimates have more than one purpose. They are your budget. So we'll talk about how we can add those expenses to an estimate and see them on budget lines. And then we'll talk about vendor invoices, entering those both for overhead and for project costs. Some folks are having their project managers, account managers, someone who's not necessarily in the purchasing or accounts payable role, entering vendor invoices if they're related to their project. So this would be a good training for them and something that you can give them access to without giving them full access to the AP section. You would allow them to be able to enter a vendor invoice. We even have features where you can approve vendor invoices that are for your projects only if you're a project manager. So that's kind of a newer feature. We're going to talk about expense reports, miscellaneous costs. We'll talk about the different options with payments, whether you're using a third-party processor, like some of those ones that are out there that will even pay you money back. We don't have a lot of information about that here. You'd go directly to the third party, but there's some information in the help guide to get you there. Fast Pay is one of those vendors I know that recently came yet. Nadi says that there's no audio and everybody else can still hear me, correct? Anybody can say yes in there. All right, awesome. The screen is dark. That's probably thank you, Kelly, too. That's something you could probably adjust on your side. I'm afraid that audio probably, if you can't hear me, is also an adjustment on your side. So thank you for sharing that, because then we can just make sure everybody's okay. But definitely we're recording this. So if audio isn't coming through and you're having some technical difficulties, you'll still be able to participate listening to the recording. The other thing we're going to discuss very briefly is credit cards and the fact that you can link with a tool that we integrate with named Plaid. And that's just a way to pull those transactions through automatically. Most credit card companies allow for that, but certainly full training on that is an hour. So we'll touch on it and talk about it just for those who are not familiar. And if you aren't using it, sounds good, and you want training on it, let us know. Training@workamajig.com, by the way, will reach your scheduler and get on your account manager's calendar. Okay, so enough about housekeeping stuff. Let's get right into it. So let's start with looking at the purchasing dashboard. So under purchasing, intuitively enough, and if you don't see this, but you think you should have access, this show all apps in the lower right-hand corner. If anybody has like customized their screen to only show certain dots, you might have to click this in order to see your purchasing option. And then today purchasing. So each one of our dashboard pages is named today, today creative, today billing. And the today purchasing page should have most things that a person in the accounts payable role would need. You can see I have some open items here. You may not show that. I keep these in here to show the option. If you don't have any requests for quotes, for instance, you're not using that feature, you actually won't see anything listed here. So don't be alarmed if you're thinking, well, I'm a admin and I don't see that. It only displays if you have something in that category: open orders, unapproved orders. And it's just a way to remind you, you all, if are probably familiar with when you have something you need to approve, it's going to be on your approval bill. So you could see things on your approval bill or here and here. There's actually an option under your system settings to display certain items in the notification section. So if you're not seeing orders and you feel like you should be, this is where you would go to check that to make sure that you've just requested that your security group can see that. If you don't have this system setting option here, then see your administrator. They'll be able to set that for you. And then, of course, incoming charges. I don't have the connector set up here because I don't have a real credit card linked to this fake account. But if I did, I'd be able to click here and open the credit card connector. That's Plaid. You have your to pays. So if you have expense reports out there that need to be paid, which we will before this session is over, vendor invoices that need to be paid, an extreme amount of credit cards in my case that need to be paid. And you might say, well, how do you have credit cards in there, Marlene? You just said you're not using Plaid. There are other ways to get credit card transactions into your system. So you may be importing them. Maybe you export a file, QFX file from your bank and import it into Workamajig. That's another option. Of course, Plaid is the easiest, but we even will allow you to just hand enter credit card charges. So typically, it depends on the volume of credit card charges you deal with. If it's very few, then you might just be hand entering them. If it's quite a lot, you're probably wanting to use Plaid to get them over automatically. And then you can see that I particularly have some checks that need to be printed. Again, that's becoming a less and less common way that we pay our vendors. We have a lot of ACH, maybe through your banking or checking account, the credit card, of course, or that third-party option where they actually pay on your behalf. So we'll talk about those. And then your views here, which are really reports. So if I wanted to see all the payments that have been made by a particular client, I'm sorry, this is vendor payment. So up to you've paid to a particular vendor, and then I'd be able to run that report. I'd be able to filter it. I'd be able to see what's open if I was looking at the list of vendor invoices. So whether or not a payment had been received. Those are two separate databases, but you can get really the same amount of information by just using the open column on the vendor invoices screen. If you're using request for quotes, you'd be able to see those in there, credit card charges, miscellaneous costs, and expense reports. So this is where you would go in general to see like everyone's expense reports, if that was your role in the purchasing role. If you just want to see your own expense reports, we'll be showing you that here in just a bit and how you would create an expense report for reimbursement. We actually only use expense reports if the person came out of pocket for their own with their own money, either cash or their own personal credit card. If the person is using a corporate credit card, the workflow for that is a little different. We typically wouldn't have the person create an expense report. Expense reports would usually result in a check being cut for reimbursement. So you wouldn't typically do that with a corporate card. Then we also have some additional reports down here, and these are set up to be, something in a person in an AP role would need. Usually AP aging is a big one that people run very frequently. Checklisting if they're just looking for checks that they've cut to a particular vendor or a particular date range. You'll see mine says currency. You probably don't have that drop down unless that's something you've activated. We don't have a lot of folks using multiple currency. So if you ever see something that's labeled currency, of course, my test system has that activated, but if you don't see that, that's perfectly fine, unless you are looking to pay bills in a different currency, and that's a training we can put you through as well, and that's free. So I won't go too much more into detail on this page, and I won't go into each one of those reports, but explore that on your own. You also have a daily feed. So I created a purchase order a little bit before this call just to make sure I had a valid vendor and that sort of thing in there, and that I had the rights to approve it. So you can see that. And then conversations, this is really just a way to generate an email that goes to someone, but have that data in Workamajig. So if you had a conversation about a vendor invoice, for instance, rather than leaving Workamajig and emailing about that, it would be better to do it here. That way you've captured that information in case you ever need to go back to it. It's also reportable. So that's very nice. If you click your blue plus icon here, this is to add anything new that has to do with purchasing. Add a new vendor invoice, add a new payment. So you have your options in here. But of course, what a lot of people, if they're somewhere else in in the system, you don't have to navigate to this page. That's extra clicks. You do have your main menu plus icon up here. So definitely helpful to be able to just come in wherever you are in the system. And if you say, well, I don't see all of those options, it is by security, right? So if you're missing something here in the purchasing section that you feel like you should have, right now you're seeing all of the options because I'm an administrator on the account. So definitely get with your administrator and we can expand your rights if needed. And then the other thing is, and just to show you, this is the same. So if I click on this and it's a new vendor invoice, same as clicking here and saying new vendor invoice, same exact screen that slides out. It's just a quicker way to get there if you're somewhere else in the system. The more icon, which you'll see almost on every page, if you click into this, you'll see display options. And what that says is, well, what do I want to see? Do I want to have meetings on this calendar? It's just like a little settings in here, maybe nothing you even need to set. If you have batches that you've sent for transactions, and I don't have any batch transactions set up in this chest account, this would be like if you were using a third party payment processor and you were sending a batch to them for them to cut the checks and make the payment, however they've agreed to make payments. Maybe it's even by credit card. If it's CSI, that's the third party vendor. So if you don't see anything in here, that just means you don't have it set up either. If it's not something you're interested in learning about, definitely there's some help guide pages, but I would get with your account manager. They won't be able to tell you how the third-party system works, but they can tell you how we integrate with them and maybe some good questions to ask if you're thinking about doing that, because sometimes there is a cost involved with that. Other times they actually pay you. So I would say do your homework on that and research those third-party payment processors to see what works for you. We can work with many of them if all they need us to do is download information and all they want from us is an upload. The print check settings, this is just a quick way to see, am I using these different payment options? So if you see something like pain.001, you might say, well, I don't know what that is. It's actually a payment initiation file. So this is a European thing, I believe. So some of these are just not turned on because they just aren't valid for very many of our users. CSI V card is another electronic payment option. So any of this, if you don't, and this is a United Kingdom thing as well. So any of this, if you don't recognize it, no problem. It just means that you probably, if you're not in the UK, you're probably not using these options. So ACH, of course, we turn on by default because almost everyone has some kind of ACH electronic fund transfer that they would use usually through their checking account in their bank. All right, so that's pretty much it for this page. Of course, if I was a person who had to enter time, you have your time entry, you have meetings, so you have things that are not necessarily purchasing related, but it's to try to keep you on one dashboard page if you're in the purchasing role. So let's talk a little bit about setup. If we were in a vendor record, which all of the records for companies are mixed with clients, vendors, even companies that aren't a client or a vendor yet, maybe they're just a prospect. So that's under the salesperson dot and your company's database. And so you can make something a favorite if it's a vendor record or a client record that you're going into frequently. But I just want to see a list of my vendors in the system. So I'm going to go to the vendor listing. I'm not going to filter it with anything other than the filter running in the back end to say only return this company if they are a vendor. And so you can see a list of your vendors here. I'm just going to go into this vendor, this RB test, and you can see that this is one that I've made a favorite. And I did that right before the call, just because this is the one that I was testing with to make sure that it has everything in it we need to show you the process. Now, as far as like markups and that kind of thing, there's different options for that in Workamajig. If you typically would put the markup based on the client you're working with, well, then you can actually add the markup, the vendor markup in the client record. If it's more driven by the type of item that's being purchased, so like all printing has a 20% markup, well, then that you would enter in the back end in your purchase items, which we'll check that out in just a moment. But sometimes you say, well, the markup is by the vendor. And that's what we're looking at here, the fact that you can add vendor information where you say for every time this vendor is selected, make sure that the markup is this particular amount. So just kind of depends on what your options are or how you typically do things as to how you're going to set some of this up. A lot of people don't put the markup at the vendor level. Also things like terms, like with this, you get a percent off, or terms net that you need to set, maybe a sales tax that has to be charged each time this particular vendor is used. So lots of different options here, even maybe a particular AP account that should be used only for this vendor. So lots of different items, a particular expense account. Whatever you need here, let us know. And then even sometimes things might be, coming up and not turned on yet. So always good to keep a line of communication up with your account manager and let them know what you're needing. And that way we can either direct you where to set it up, or we can say, that's a great idea. Maybe we need to do some more research on that, see who else wants that, and add that as a feature. So the key is communication, of course. And then there could be contacts in here. This one does have a contact. There could be purchase orders that have already been done for this client. So this is just another way to get to that. If you would find that easier than looking at a whole list of purchase orders, you say, I just want to see all the purchase orders for this particular vendor. You navigate to that vendor record and you're going to be able to see that kind of thing here, all the payments. So all the even publications and stations, if this happens to be a media vendor, although we're not going to talk media particularly today. We do have a media module training. I believe that's a webinar in the past, and also your account manager can do that session with you too. That's an hour-long session. All right, so we're going to close out of the vendor record. Just wanted to show you how to navigate to that, the types of things you can default there. We did just say that you could add the markup at the actual item level. So admin manager system setup is where you would find that. We do have a purchasing option here, and you would go to the purchase items section, and this is where you could add that automatic markup. So I'm just going to open one of these by spinning it out, and then you can see that if I put the markup here, then that would feed through every time I select this item. Same thing with taxes. If you say, well, we are required to tax this item, tax our client for this item. So if this item is selected, it needs to be taxed. You can set that up here as well. And if you have piggyback taxes, you're in Canada, tax 2 that applies even. So definitely some items there, and you can get further training on that from your account manager for whatever specific situation you might have. It's different state to state as to what items need to be taxed. If the vendor is charging you tax, you don't have to call that out or bring that out as a separate line on the vendor invoice. You can just enter that as part of your total that's going to be paid, unless there's a special circumstance where you need to capture that amount because you're going to be able to take it off of your taxes or something like that. And everybody has, certain things that they can do. So we don't train on that because it is kind of state by state. So definitely reach out to your account manager if you have any questions about that kind of tax piece of it. You can see some of these say out of pocket, or OOP, which stands for out of pocket. At the front, some of them say out, so it's outsourced service. That's not required production. You don't have to put it into categories like that. We just show that as an option in our initial setup. And really, it's more for you just being able to easily select the correct option in here. You'll even see a lot of things that, you think, well, out of pocket, that is more of an expense report. And that's true. It just depends on if you're using a corporate card or personal cash or personal credit card as to whether you would be picking from the purchase item list or picking from the expense report item list. So if someone has a question, I'm going to pause just for a moment and see if that's something we can answer right away. Someone says, are these purchases items just for cost of goods sold, or is it for overhead expenses as well? Excellent question, Cindy. So in the purchase item section, your overhead is going to be included in there too. So some folks even put like OH or something in the front to indicate that it's overhead only, but usually you just don't have a sales GL account if it's going to be only an overhead purchase. Sometimes, people they separate them out, but it's not required to set them out. Definitely good question on that. Now, expense report entries, those are separated out. So if we click on expense report items, we pretty much load a typical list of airfare, car rental, hotel, things that would be out of pocket. But the person is only going to be selecting from this list if they are creating an expense report. So not a corporate card charge, but their own personal credit card was used and they need a check for reimbursement. So this list is usually a little shorter. And a lot of folks now have a corporate card, and then if everybody has a corporate card and no one would ever have to come out of pocket cash, then you wouldn't even need this section. However, there's things like mileage and paying for parking, and there's always going to be something that someone needs a reimbursement for. So whatever expense report items your company needs is what would be included here. And then I'm going to spin this open too, just to show you that you can add a unit rate for, so for something like mileage, I should have picked mileage. That makes the most sense. You could add a unit rate in there, and then it would calculate when somebody puts in, oh, it was 20 miles. They wouldn't have to remember what the unit rate was. It would pre-populate for them. So that's kind of a nice thing too. All right, I'm going to close out of that one, and then I'm going to go into the fun GL settings, action GL tracking options. This is where you would default in certain general ledger accounts. So for things like default GL accounts section, when it comes to accounts payable, what's the vendor invoice account if you have a general one that you want defaulted? What about a default expense account? You could have that set in here. Anything that you want defaulted, you would set back here, and that way if it's not selected on the front end or you've left it off when you were doing setup of the purchase items, it doesn't just refuse to post and go nowhere. It knows the GL account to hit. Things like pre-billed purchase items, this is only if you're creating purchase orders to bill. So not everyone does that, even if they use our purchase order feature. Sometimes they are just creating that as a placeholder. Purchase orders in and of themselves don't hit the general ledger. It's just when there is a vendor invoice that's attached to them, that vendor invoice hits the general ledger. But so you could close a purchase order that you opened with there'd be no ramifications for that unless you pre-billed it. And that means you actually select it as a transaction when you're creating your invoice. A lot of people bill fixed fee, so that wouldn't be relevant for fixed fee billing. It'd only be relevant if you're billing time and materials or actuals, and you selected a purchase order to bill. Even if you did that unintentionally, it's going to put it in a reversal, so that an accrual account, so that whenever you connect the vendor invoice to that purchase order, then it's going to reverse that accrual out. So if you are pre-billing purchase orders intentionally, you have to be really kind of specific and do it the same way every time, so you don't have, it gets confusing when you have some purchase orders you pre-billed, some you didn't. It's easier if you just consistently do it the same way. But purchase order, if it's not pre-billed, it's not going to hit your general ledger. It's really just a placeholder there. And then there's some advanced purchasing tracking in here as well, like recognized credit card charges as payments. Some of this we would train you in on, particularly if you're using multi-currency, we'll train you on that. So we're not going to get into those right now, except for you to know that they're back there, they're options, and you can get additional training on it for your specific situation if you need to. One thing that banks offer sometimes now, and this is very popular in the UK, I think it's becoming more popular in the US, is they want a list of you of valid payments. It's to prevent check fraud. So if somebody, tries to present a check off of your checking account and it doesn't list on the positive pay layout that you've sent them, they won't pay it when it's presented. You would know if your bank requires this, so definitely let us know if you need any help getting that set up. Usually the bank wants it in a very specific format and we can help with that. Back here is also where you're going to find if you need to set up general ledger companies. You really only need that if you have separate EIN tax numbers and you're actually doing, some taxes that you have to pay separately. Maybe you own the building that your company is in, and that's under a separate GL company. We won't get into training on that today, but whenever you enter a purchase item, if you have GL companies set up, you'll see on mine, because I do have that you have to pick the correct GL company. Again, that's more advanced setup, but if you have that, you know about it. If you're interested in looking into it more, see your account manager and they'll help you out with that. All right, so let's get right into a project. I set a project up in the system before the call, so I'm going to use my favorite feature here. It defaults to global search, but I'm going to go into recent, where I was getting rid of some expense reports too in the meantime. So I am going to have to search. And it's under 22 for the year. And so I'm going to bring that up. And there's my new project, 22. And I'm going to access it. And then I'm going to go right to the estimate. So this one has an estimate in it. Just for training purposes, I'm going to delete this. So let me unapprove it. By the way, if you're ever in here and you're like, wow, I really needed to delete something and I don't see the option to delete, it could just be a security right that you need to be given if that's part of your workflow, that you might create an estimate that you wouldn't be keeping. So normally you would come in and it would be a clean slate, be this screen, and you're going to say, I'm going to create a new estimate. We're going to use the auto pull from schedule. What that will do is any hours that are in the project schedule are going to pull through. So it's all hours. If I click into this, you'll see these are hours. We're not really talking about time transactions right now. So I just wanted to show you how that got there, but we're going to talk about the expense part of it. So we're going to go into gross expenses, add a new expense. And then what we'd love for you to do is, it's actually required, is pick the item that is going to be needed as an expense here. And I'm just going to pick supplies, something easy. Now notice I have like, well, there's supplies, production supplies, out-of-pocket supplies. This is really up to you how difficult or complicated, that's the word I'm looking for, that you need this to be. Most people just have one: supplies, production supplies. And the reason it's production is this is not overhead. This is getting charged to our client. That doesn't mean you have to have a separate line for the overhead supplies unless you have different GL accounts you want to hit automatically with the back-end purchase items set up. Most people don't. They usually just have one: supplies. And then the description is coming from the backend setup that we just visited. You don't have to know the vendor yet because we're going to create a purchase order, and at that time we can pick a vendor. But if you know the vendor, you could enter it. And I have one in here that I tested with earlier, so I know it's ready to go. That's that same one that I made a favorite that we looked at the record of earlier. And then, whatever it is, certainly you don't have to pick a quantity. That's nice if you need to run reporting later. But if it's just like general supplies and you're just trying to get a budget line item that will have a purchase order that's tied to it, you could just go right to the gross. So you could say, well, it's $100 in supplies. And if you know the markup, this is what I was saying, that you can always add the markup at the time you're entering the purchase item on the estimate. And that's if you're going to do estimate billing, bill to the approved estimate, this is the time where you'd want to add it. If it's set in the back end, it would have pre-populated here, either at the client level or at the actual item level, wherever you set that markup. And of course, the easiest thing is just to pop it in here. The question is, does everyone know? And is everyone doing that accurately? And are people remembering to put it there? So defaulting it from one of those other places kind of takes that off their plate to have to remember it. I didn't actually have a unit rate in here, so let me go ahead and put that 100. That, by the way, is something that we see a lot when somebody will say to me, well, it didn't work. I didn't, and it has to do with like the order of operations. See how it grossed it out. So if I came here and did the unit cost, so it's a little tricky depending on what order you put things in. And some folks have a little chat here. So let me say, markup is a percentage. How do you input it if the set dollar amount for the markup? That's a great question. So you can actually, instead of putting a percentage, thank you for that question, Cindy, I could have just said an amount here, and then it's going to back calculate the markup. So really great question there. That's something that I should have showed you without you having to ask. It says, is this an expense entry or a PO? Good question, because I keep referring to the fact that it's going to become a PO. And the truth is, it doesn't have to be a purchase order, but this is our recommended workflow if you need to create a purchase order that is not overhead. Obviously, if it's an overhead purchase order, it's not going to be part of a project, part of an estimate. But if you need to create the purchase order, you would do it usually from the estimate because it's going to pre-populate and pull all the data in for you. So excellent question, Laura. I'm kind of using those two interchangeably, and it may not be. If it's an overhead purchase order, then you're going to come here and enter that as get this out of the way. So you would come in here and just start entering the purchase order if that were the case. But in this example, we're going to say, well, this is a purchase order that we're creating from an approved estimate. So Excellent question. The other thing that you can do here too is you could create a quote. So request for quote, that what that's going to do, and you have to have everything set up for that, but it's going to email the vendor as long as you have everything set up to do that, and it's going to give them the option to approve. Again, we train on that very infrequently. That seems to have been something that people must be handling another way, or maybe there's like maybe with the website says what the quote amounts are, is not so much a back and forth with the vendor for printing and that sort of thing as it used to be. So we don't do that as part of the regular training. However, if you want quote training, definitely let us know. And we also have a really nice help guide on requests for quotes, so you may not even need to speak with anyone. But in our case, we're going to say that this is an approved estimate, so I'm going to approve it. If yours says submit here, that's because in the estimate settings, it'll be set who the internal approver is. I made sure that this was set for me before the call so that I could easily approve it. So we're going to approve this estimate. And now that it's approved, it becomes our budget. And it's going to take just a minute to get it all approved out. And then we're going to go in and create the PO from it. So of course, this may not be all at the same time. You may be navigating back to this, but you need to be on this same screen that we were earlier. And under more, you're going to see the option to create order. And that's talking about creating a purchase order. So we're going to click on create order. We're selecting because there might be more than one expense here, and maybe you're not creating a purchase order for all of them. If you were and there was more than one, you have a top box selection here, but we're just going to select the one that we have there, and we're going to say create the PO. So once the PO is created, and you'll see some churning up there, you'll see that it's in here, then depending on what you have listed in your employee record, you may or may not be able to approve that PO right away. If you don't have in your employee record the ability to approve for that dollar amount, because that's a fairly large dollar amount too, then instead of saying approve here, we'll say submit. And then whoever is set as the PO approver, and there's, in their employee record, it would say, and if you only want one person to do it, say, then you'll just only populate that PO approval limit in that one person's employee record. And you need to pick the highest amount of a PO you'd ever create as the maximum for their PO. But mine is set that I have the limit to be able to just go ahead and approve this. So I'm going to approve it. Also, if I was submitting it to someone, that's another thing that you would see in your bell. So it would say purchase order, and you'd see that you had a purchase order to approve. You can have more than one person with the same limit. And so you may, if you need this to go to a particular supervisor or something, you can drill into your little pencil icon here, and you can pick a different person to approve it. So, it just depends. And this one's already approved, so you don't see that option. But you can be a little bit more specific in who is doing your approvals. If you need any help setting that up, basically just tell us how you want it to work, and we'll tell you exactly what you need to change in your system to get it to work in the optimal way for approving POs. Unlike approving estimates and approving some of the other things that are set under transaction preferences and like overall for the system, the POs are set in employee records, so it's a little bit different. The other thing you might want to do, if you had a spec sheet that needed to be attached to this, maybe you need to notify someone that this purchase order is available, anything you need to do workflow wise for you, just let us know and we can help you work out a workflow. Right now, there is no vendor invoice yet entered for this, but we're going to rectify that. We're going to pretend like the vendor invoice has now come in, and we're going to attach it to this purchase order. So I'm going to close out of all these screens because you might typically be maybe even on your purchasing today page when that vendor invoice comes in and you're ready to enter it and connect it to the PO. So plus for a new vendor invoice, and then you're going to pick the vendor, and then down over here, you're going to see all the available orders to select from. So depending on, I have more than one in here, you want to pick the order that corresponds with the vendor invoice you're being selected. Now, this goes to the point where some people will have one purchase order, like one giant purchase order that they kind of chip away at for the vendor. You can do that. We don't regularly recommend that because then you kind of get to a point where there might be a few cents, and then what do? You can just close the line, but you can do that. You can definitely have like an open standing PO that multiple vendor invoices are put against. But most people do have a separate one, so you'd pick the one that you were looking to select. And then you might say, well, that one was only for $100. Well, that's the net amount. So it didn't include the markup because, of course, I'm not going to pay the vendor that markup amount. That's the amount that's going to show on the client's transactions if you were to bill them individual transactions. And then you would just put whatever invoice number is on that invoice that you've been presented, either electronically or physically mailed an invoice, maybe by the vendor. And then you're going to have the invoice date. And this is, sorry, it's I have mine set to Canada, I believe. So it's showing the date and then the month and then the year. But you would select the invoice date that corresponds with the physical invoice and then the due date. Now, if the due date is set in the vendor record for 30 days out, it would automatically push this out 30 days. So just something to note. If there were sales taxes that had to be added, that would have been set up in the back end. So you would enter that. If there was a description that's needed, you can enter that. If this was overhead, you would select that. It's not in this case, it's not overhead. You can't even set up overhead vendors. So like if you pay rent to a particular vendor, that's never going to be included on a project. That's always going to be overhead. You can set that in the vendor record and then this box gets checked automatically. And so we are going to say save because the project number is in that purchase order. So the system already knows the project number. It's already picking everything up. We don't have to re-enter that information. And then it's just asking you to confirm, hey, do you want to close this? Are you using the whole thing? Yes, I do. So when I select it, and then I'm going to close it out, and then I'm going to hit save. So now that purchase order is tied out, it's closed to the vendor or it's attached to the vendor invoice. You can see I have a little note here saying, oh, you have $600 of prepayments. That's referring to prepayments that maybe were for this particular vendor. So not always would you have prepayments in your system for your vendor, but if you did, you get a nice little red notification letting you know that. So we still haven't paid this, however, and we still haven't even gotten this approved. All we've done is attach the purchase order to it. So I am the approver. If I drill into this, you could make the approver someone different, but we have it set that I'm the approver. You could change that and route it to someone. But I'm going to go ahead just in the interest of time and keeping things moving. I'm going to approve it. And as we know, it hasn't hit the general ledger yet, right? Because in Workamajig, you have to post. So once we posted, and then I did this on purpose, a line is missing a GL account. So these are the kind of things that sometimes people don't know how to troubleshoot, or they don't know what the message is saying here. So when it says a line is missing a GL account, it's saying that this particular item, because there's only one line on here, is not connected to the general ledger. And that's usually defaulting in. So you probably don't get this message very often. But if you've added, say a new person added a purchase item and they didn't realize they need to have a default GL, or they've picked something that isn't really an expense account, something like that, then you just come in here to fix that. So I don't even know what I have as an expense GL in here, probably we'll say lodging. These are lodging supplies. And then you see it turns green. And now when I say post, it's going to say, oh, okay, well, now you can post because you've got a general ledger in there. Again, this is the kind of troubleshooting that shouldn't happen if you have everything set up correctly. But we all know the truth is we have, maybe somebody new setting something up. They didn't go through original training. They didn't know that if you don't have those GL accounts predetermined there in the back end, that you would have to spin this line open to see it and select it. The other thing is once it's posted, we can look at the posting details. I like to do this so I can see, is that what I wanted? Is this the correct item where it should be? And that's a nice thing to be able to look at right away. All right, so that's the vendor invoice. Now that vendor invoice has kind of replace the purchase order if you're talking about time and materials billing and you're going to bill the actual. So now you're no longer pre-billing the order. If you were to grab the transactions there, the order won't be there to select. And we'll just go to the project so you can see that. If you're looking at a list of transactions on this project, you can see we only have the one. That makes it sure easy, and it's under voucher. prior to me connecting the two, it would have been under order for the header. And that's why sometimes folks will pre-bill the order, maybe even accidentally, if they're in the billing screen and they're billing directly from the project and they say, oh yeah, I just want to bill all the transactions, because the orders do show as a transaction here. So I'm going to navigate away from here, and it's time to add another transaction to heat this, and that is the miscellaneous cost. So miscellaneous costs in Workamajig are, my best example for this is like stock photography. You've purchased thousands of dollars in stock photography, and now this particular project needs to use one of those images. Well, whether or not we're going to pass that exact cost along to the client, or whether it's just wrapped up in the estimate amount that we're going to bill them as a fixed fee, we still need to get that miscellaneous cost on the project so that it affects profitability. We want to see that there was a transaction that costs us money here. We don't have a vendor invoice to enter against it because maybe we did the stock photography purchase 6 months ago and it's just sitting there and we've paid it, but though we haven't really recognized any of that that expense. So if you go to the miscellaneous cost section of any project, and by the way, a project is the only way to enter miscellaneous cost. So if it is like an overhead thing that you need to have a project for, you can, but usually it's automatically overhead until you add it as a miscellaneous cost. So we're going to say add a miscellaneous cost here. You'd pick the item. Do I have stock photography in here? That would be great if I did, but I don't, since I use that as my example. But basically anything that you would have bought in bulk, we'll just pick photography there. And then maybe it was 2 of the images, and then you decide what the unit cost is. It's $1,000 or whatever. And then that'll calculate your total cost. It defaults that it's going to be billable to the client. You could add a markup if you're billing actuals. So if I said I'm going to put a 20% markup in there, then it'll calculate the amount. If you add a comment here, you can choose to print that comment on an invoice. So sometimes people want to say, what the stock photography was or something to that effect. And then I'm just going to click anywhere in the white. You saw it flash green there for a second. That's just letting me know it did save that line. And of course, if I needed to add another miscellaneous cost, I would just do insert row, insert row, insert row till all my miscellaneous costs were entered. That then puts that again in the transactions section. So if we go back and run that transactions again, now you have a miscellaneous cost and a voucher. If folks are putting time entry against this project, you'd have another category labeled labor. And then you'd be able to see all of that too. So good to be able to see everything that is affecting the profitability of this project here. And that's really all there is to miscellaneous costs. Not a lot involved there. You're just capturing the amount that you either want to bill or that needs to be attached for purposes to see how profitable it was. Cindy has another great question. What happens if you receive an invoice from a vendor that is associated to multiple projects? Very good question. So if you have a vendor invoice and it could be for multiple clients even, but certainly multiple projects, you're going to add that on the line. So I'm going to revisit the vendor invoice just for a second to answer that question, because I think that's one other folks might have as well. So I'm going to go back into my recent, back into my vendor invoice. I'm going to unapprove and unpost the vendor invoice so I can make changes and show you how that would work. So you would say, okay, this vendor invoice has another project. And so you would pick the project that it was, and then you pick probably the same item because you're getting billed, for the one amount usually that you have to kind of divvy up between the projects. I pick by the same GL account number, which I think was supplies. So you just keep doing that. Oh, a selected project is not valid for the company. Well, because I have GL companies, I mentioned that earlier, certain clients are not for the particular GL company that the default is. But in your case, if you don't have GL companies set up, that wouldn't happen to you. You essentially would just be picking actual projects that are probably related. So you wouldn't even get that error message. But definitely multiple lines totally makes sense when you have different projects to split it up amongst. Good question. Okay, so we'll get back out of this one. And the next thing I want to show you is expense reports. It really is a very simple process, very intuitive for folks, but there is a special training on it if you ever just want to share with the team if they're going to start submitting expense reports. You also can do it on their behalf. So if I navigate to the main menu, Under everyone, you see expense reports. Now, of course, if I was here on the today purchasing, I wouldn't have to navigate out and do all those clicks. I could just say, let me just do an expense report. From here. I guess I can't do it from here because it might be for somebody else. So you'd have to do it from your main menu. So you could do an expense report without nope, you cannot. I'm a liar. So it's up here under everyone. We don't put it under purchasing. Interesting. I'm surprised it's not in both places because we usually like to cover bases like that and have things repeat. But in this case, you always have to be under the everyone. And I guess that makes sense because you're not always entering them on behalf of someone. You're kind of hoping they're going to be entering them themselves. Now, if they just click on the expense report dot, that's going to show if they have any pending expense reports, like this one that I created a while ago, Tuesday, October 6th on 2020. It was submitted and never approved, and I'd be able to manage my own expense reports. You're only going to see your own data here. If you're managing other folks, which a lot of people on this webinar probably are, then you're going to go to the main menu, and then you're going to go to Admin Manager, Today Manager, and here you're going to see a list of expense reports. I do get that question a lot, just because people might do expense reports infrequently, and they would say, you know, I don't see it here to approve, but my employee says they submitted one. The first troubleshooting step there is to just look at it. It's probably usually what the case is that they don't have somebody listed in their employee record as their expense report approver. Maybe when they were first set up, you didn't intend then to use expense reports, or you didn't think they would be, so you didn't set that. So that's something you could easily see here. We have some different ones set up as categories. If we go back in there, I'll show them to you. Things like all open expense reports, all of them that have been approved but not paid, my expense reports paid, submitted and approved. So definitely different categories there. You can always just start with all. And even if you say, well, I really just want to see all, not just all open, if you have the rights to modify, you can remove that filter. It's just this is already filtering out to say, well, anything that's not been submitted and not been rejected, show me those. So but definitely this is a good place if you're trying to troubleshoot, like, why don't I see it? You know, why didn't it get submitted? Because it'll say submit, even if the person doesn't have somebody listed in their client or their employee record that they're submitting to. So this is a frequent area that people are emailing about or saying, how do I see a list of expense reports? Not just my expense reports. Those they can get to very easily, but they don't realize it's under Admin Manager, Today Manager to see a list. I'm going to enter a new one. So I'm going to do the blue plus icon. And I'm going to say new expense report, and then it's fairly intuitive. It spins the line open for you, so you don't have to click on that. You would pick the item, so something like mileage that you're getting reimbursed for. If there was a unit rate in the back end, 59 cents or whatever it is now per mile, probably should be $1 a mile at this point, then you would be able to see that come through automatically. I don't have it set back there. And then maybe you went 100 miles, and then probably would have to do your unit cost in here. You probably don't have a markup involved because the markup is included in whatever the unit rate that you've entered is. So you can just enter that information. Now you also can say there's a paper receipt if you're routing a piece of paper to the person who you're submitting this expense report to for approval, but hardly anyone does that anymore. Most people scan it and then they have it saved, they select it, that'll then add it as an attachment here. So if someone is approving this, they don't have to go track down a physical piece of paper. They have an attachment here of a scanned copy of the receipt. And then once you get these entered, and by the way, they might be overhead or they might be going to a particular project. If they're going to a particular project, you'll see, I'll pick that same project, you'll see it represented in that transaction section under expense report. So it does have its own category. And then I'm going to submit this for approval, and it says your expense report has been submitted. If I was managing my own expense reports, I would see it here and it would let me know, okay, I have 2 open that have been submitted, but they haven't been approved. I should probably follow up on that if I'm ever going to get paid. So once I don't know who I have set I don't have myself set as the expense report approver, which I probably should have. But anyway, once the expense report is approved, and I'd be able to see that in the today purchasing if there was expense reports that needed to be approved and paid, then I would be able to come in here, select them, and pay. Now, let's talk a little bit about payment in the last 10 minutes here that we have left. There's different, of course, methods, and we talked about this at the top of the session, that you might have a third-party system where they're making the payments on your behalf. That probably more common is ACH payments that are coming out of your own checking account. So then that's really twofold, right? Because yes, you have to process the payment here in Workamajig, but there's nothing then that connects back to your bank and says that it was an ACH. So you still need that payment generated in Workamajig so it debits your checking account and so that your books are accurate. And that's a step that I think sometimes confuses folks that are maybe new to AP. They don't realize that there's two steps, that not only, you're not cutting a check in this case in an ACH payment out of Workamajig, you're going to your bank, you're indicating, yes, here's the vendor invoice I want you to pay. They're sending the electronic payment. That's not enough. Workamajig also has to see that that electronic payment was made so that your books are accurate. So where it says to pay as of, and by the way, this can throw people off too. This is to pay as of today's date. But if you just entered a vendor invoice and in the vendor record, it defaulted in that it's a 30-day payout. If you look for it here, you're not going to find it because it's saying, oh, well, it's not due until 30 days from now. So you can remedy that in one or two ways. If you know you're going to pay it right away when you're entering the vendor invoice, you don't want to have a payment due date that's 30 days out. If you do need to capture that, I paid it early, was due 30 days out, but I'm capturing the actual date the payment was made, then you just need to make sure that you push this out to a date that'll capture everything that you have in there that you're ready to pay. And so we're going to do vendor invoices. You could filter this, but usually people don't have a lot of filters in here. They want to see everything that's available to pay. And then if there's something, this is that one we entered. If there's something they don't want to pay, they just don't select that. So if there's 20 items, you don't want to pay one of them, you could select them all and then deselect the one you don't want to pay. It does give you a subtotal. So of all the payments that are in here, we only have one. But if you had 10, it would add them up and tell you how much you're paying. And then when you click on this, you have the option to either cash or credit. Cash is really, of course, just coming out of your checking account. It's not really cash usually. And then the credit is, well, I paid this with a credit card, or I want this to be entered as a credit card option. So when you drop this down, you'll see your credit card options. It'll default to today and you can say generate payments. But let's do this first. We're going to do just creating a regular payment. And even if I paid by ACH, I could still just say generate the payment, but then it's going to show as a check to print. Well, I don't really, and I'm going to refresh this screen just so it shows there. So, but I don't really necessarily want to print this check. I need an ACH payment. So all you would do is come in here and say that you're going to mark as an ACH and post the payment. So we tried to make that a little bit easier. If you've been with us for a while, we didn't used to have this option. You just went in and put like the ACH number or some approval code or whatever they gave you in the check number field. And that then suppressed it from coming up when you're physically printing your checks. But we made this a little easier where you can just say mark ACH and post the payment. There is also mark ACH, post and email the vendors. This only works, and add to batch only works if you have that like third party setup, so don't worry about those. If you're not set up for that right now, we'll fully train you on that if you did adopt one of those options where they're basically making the payments on your behalf. So you're not going into your checking account and saying, oh, send the payment. They're doing it through a batch posting. And like I said, I don't know exactly how all that works on their end, but they would train you, and then we would also train you on the part that you would do in Workamajig. What they're really looking for is a file that you send to them. But of course, sometimes we are printing the check at, just like old school. So you could say print checks. When you do that, this signature file password, I must have set that up. I don't know how long ago when I was testing something. I have no idea what the file password is on this. So we're just going to have to pretend like that because I don't even think that's really what it is. That's for my actual other login, but you would know that. And most people do not set up that feature. That's a a feature that's very lightly used. If you have like multiple people that are making payments and you know want to have them have a password. Again, it's because it's going to automatically print a signature on the check, and that's a feature that's very lightly used because folks, you know, when they are cutting physical checks, there's usually a person who's signing them, and that's a second set of eyes that's saying, yes, this is actually a check we should be paying. And then again, we talked about the positive pay file, even that some people have to send to their bank saying, yes, it's okay to pay this check. So lots of systems in place to try to prevent check fraud. All right, we have a couple more questions. Let me get those answered. So someone's asked, and it was Laura, very good question. Well, when would you use the ACH box at the bottom? So if you look at the settings here, so let me close this and then we'll get Katie's question answered too. It says that if you have to have the ACH enabled for that vendor, and then you set the values in their vendor record under purchasing defaults in the payment option. And so this information would be pulling, like use the ACH information that's on file in their vendor record. So very good question. You know, you would have to have the bank routing number. That's a little bit less used as well. You can see that there's like, if you do use this feature, do I send the data in all caps? Sometimes the file requirement at the bank end is it has to be all capital letters, usually to avoid like what's the difference between an I and a lowercase l, uppercase I and lowercase l. So a lot of that kind of thing, but you would get that information from your bank if you needed to populate this. I personally don't have anybody using this feature right now, so I know it is fairly lightly used, but you would know. And then Laura says, well, how secure is Workamajig if we used it to store our bank vendor information? So maybe that's another reason this is a lightly used feature, that you do have to enter bank information. But my guess, at least with like tax EIN numbers, and numbers for your contractor social security number, those are masked. My guess is that this is masked as well. But like I said, I don't actually have any experience using this, no client using this right now. So that's a great question. And you could even, I wonder if we could even, what if we just started entering something right now? So it's not masked upon entry, but if it was set up correctly in the vendor invoice in the back end, it might come through masked here, usually as asterisks. So great question. And then Katie had a question as well. And it says, I manually send out remittance emails now to vendors. Is there a way for the system to manually send those when the payments are issued? So I think that's what this is talking about here, Katie, is this mark ACH, post and email the vendors. So that would be something we could test with you to make sure it works the way you want it to. We'd have a fake vendor. You could use like a personal email address, like a Hotmail or Gmail or something account, just to make sure they see what you want them to see. But I'm pretty sure the question that you're asking is this: mark ACH, post and email vendors. So definitely get with your account manager if you want to test through that, make sure it works the way you hope it does, because that could be a big time saver, it sounds like. We just have to make sure everything was populated in the vendor record. It'd have to have the contact, and the contact email address would have to be accurate. But yeah, I believe that works as you're hoping. Okay, great questions, everybody. So we're getting to the end here. I really don't have a lot of time to talk about credit cards, but truthfully, that's a full nother training in itself. We've touched on it briefly, but essentially you have the option enter manually, which that's coming up here and actually saying, let me enter a credit card charge. This is less and less frequent as we're having more and more things like Facebook that require you have a credit card charge on file, and then it's hundreds of transactions. Most people aren't coming here and manually entering those. They're pulling them through from Plaid that connects with their credit card, or they're downloading a QFX, OFX, CSV file from their credit card company and then importing or updating that, pulling it into Workamajig. So very rare that somebody is actually entering credit card charges now, but it is still an option. And then, of course, the favorite option is Plaid. If you can set that up, most credit card companies accept Plaid as the standard. If your credit card company won't, then you may have to do the upload of the file, but that's fairly simple as well. It's actually under Admin Manager because it's an import. So you would import it, and then there's credit card in here. And notice there's credit card charges or credit card connector. You're going to pick credit card connector. And well, depending on the data you get from your bank, I should say. So if they're not giving you, a financial institution ID and that sort of thing, then you may not be able to use this one. But usually folks are pulling this in through the credit card connector screen. The credit card charges screen just puts it on the credit card charges in Workamajig. That would be like if you only have like the charge date, the account, the cost, and who purchased it. Those are the required fields. The reason who purchased it is required is in the employee record, there's an option to pick the credit card approver. So you'd have to have that populated so that it knew where to route to get that approved. And we do have time for one last question, and it's from Cindy. And it says, we only use Amex. I guess that won't be an issue connecting with Plaid. You're absolutely correct, Cindy. Amex actually, whoever funded, created the Plaid option it was connected with Amex. So it works beautifully with Amex. The bank that it doesn't work with, I think that's a big one, I think is Chase, if I'm not mistaken, but it actually calls that out in the help guide when you look at Plaid. And for those of you who are not familiar with Plaid and are interested in getting that set up, if you just search the word Plaid, as in like the material Plaid, it tells you step by step how to do it. But of course, your account manager will walk you through it together. It even has screenshots that would be generated from like the banking end. Once you start to get down here, it says, well, which bank do you want to link with? And then it lists the banks. It gives you like some troubleshooting things. If you have like more than one city, like which one of these Citibank accounts do I select? So it tries to help you and walk you through that with some of the gotchas that might be in there. I'm looking to see if we call out the bank that we don't. There's a big one. I think it's Chase, but that we don't, but you'll know because the minute you try to connect, it won't show up on your list and you won't be able to do it. So, but this is a really nice document with screenshots that kind of tells you what to expect. If you wanted to review this before committing to setting up Plaid, you could see like, well, how is this really going to work? One more question. I know I already said one more, but I hate to leave somebody with a question. And it's Deborah. She's not questioning. She's telling me it doesn't work with Capital One. Thank you. I knew it was one of the big ones. So that's a shame. And eventually maybe they will connect with Plaid and allow that, but it doesn't sound like they do at this time. So, and somebody says it absolutely does work with Chase. So I had that wrong. I had the C part right. That was it. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your time today. It's nice to have a group that's interactive and asks questions. So that's awesome. And definitely we don't consider this full and experienced training. It's more like an overview. So, and you're very welcome, Laura. It's good to hear from Laura. I've talked to Laura in the past too. And Meg. Hi, Meg. All right. And Cindy. All right, guys. Thank you for your time. Have a good afternoon. We'll talk soon.